Have a look at this. This is, in my opinion, truly a beautiful watch. I don't wear it very often as my preference for a daily wearer is more of a black dial with a tool watch look. I just don't need to wear dress watches very often. That said, this IWC Regulator, or Regulateur as it's called, isn't that dressy. It's not dainty and a little wishy-washy like, say, some JLCs with their silver hands and silver numerals. The case is a solid 43mm, the hands are blued steel, and the watch speaks a very clear design language. We have black railroad tracks around both the minute, hour and seconds registers, and we have a very minimalistic and no-nonsense approach to the category. The dial is technically silver, but in person it appears virtually white, so the watch has real contrast and high legibility, unlike some more dressy dress watches like certain JLCs. You can tell what time it is without having to first angle your wrist to make sure the hands catch the light just the right way. I usually take the strap off a new watch and put on my own, both to not damage the original strap and because I have my particular taste in straps. But I have never removed the original IWC alligator strap from this watch. The mid-brown perfectly matches the dial and it has real heft to it, like the watch. It's firm but comfortable, thick but elegant. Sometimes I sit in the living room at night watching TV or reading, and I suddenly think of this watch lying in my watch box in my home office at the other end of the apartment. Then quite often I'll get up, walk the fair distance back to the office, pick up my watch and bring it back to the sofa. I will then just sit with it and turn it around, looking at it. It's the only watch I do that with. It's just that exquisite in both design and execution. And I imagine it's what people who like diamonds would do if they had the Koh-i-Noor lying in a wooden box in the flat. Sometimes you just have to bring it out to fiddle with it. It's like it restores something in you, a sense of beauty, purpose even. If man or nature can create something this refined, then wars and destruction, illness and sadness are all things that should be overcome and not succumb to. Out of chaos we can make order and beauty if we just put our minds to it. It's a bit much, I know, but that's sort of how this watch makes me feel. Strangely enough, for something that can evoke all those feelings, this was a short-lived model. The IWC Regulator was only produced from 2007 to 2009, and I presume the production hold was down to limited demand. The Portugueser, of course, is still going strong with a multitude of models: small seconds, chronograph, perpetual calendar, annual calendar, tourbillon, minute repeater, power reserve, retrograde calendar, grand complication, yacht club, and even a sidereal time model. And then there are these special boutique editions and some other ones and various combinations. And all those many versions of the Portugueser you can go and buy right now. But you can't buy a Regulator anymore. That went in 2009 when this was discontinued. It seems quite mad, considering how I feel about this watch, but there you have it. This can only be bought on the pre-owned market, and there usually aren't that many for sale. I guess because the other owners feel the way I do. I just couldn't bring myself to part with this, to not have this in my watch box anymore. Never say never, of course, but currently selling this would be akin to removing Aphrodite from Greek mythology, and I've owned it for about half a year now. The lack of popularity is presumably down to this being a regulator. This, of course, means that each unit of time has its own register. Normally, like here, the minutes hand takes precedence and the hour register is reduced in size, just as the second register. I won't get into details here, I might do a separate video on this, but regulator watches stem from the 1700s and they were later often used with the railroads, where a train station would have a regulator clock that the employees could synchronize their personal pocket watches to. Also, watchmakers would often have one of these in the workshop for an easy to read reference time. So the idea is accuracy, in terms of the movement inside, but not least in terms of giving prominence to the most important unit of time for most, the minutes. Basically, the minute hand should be unobstructed and it should be easy to take an accurate reading of it. Hence the regulator, that you regulate your own watch after. These days, we are so accustomed to the ubiquitous sharing of the hour and minute register that it actually takes a second longer to tell the time on one of these, but that's not really important. The whole accuracy thing was certainly not missed by IWC when they created this watch. It is the most accurate I own. When put on a time grapher, the reading is either 0 seconds or 1 second. This fits with my personal experience of it gaining about a third of a second per day, but depending on use, it's sometimes spot on atomic time. That's really something. Inside the watch is the caliber 98-245, which is a child of the mid-century pocket watch 98 movement. The name of the case style, a Portuguesa, stems from two Portuguese buyers of IWC requesting a wristwatch that was as accurate as a marine chronometer, i.e. a highly accurate clock used on a ship to determine longitude. We are talking the 1930s, and the only way to do that at the time was to use a pocket watch movement. Normal wristwatches weren't all that accurate at the time. The result was a 43mm watch. That was required to house a movement of that type, and that's also the size of this one, made around 70 years later. From lug to lug it measures 51mm and it's relatively slim at 12mm. It's a manual wind and the power reserve is just under 2 full days at 46 hours. The lug width is 22mm, which is a very good choice for a 43mm watch. 20 or 21 would have been unbalanced with this case size. Now, 43mm doesn't seem extreme by 21st century standards, where watches like the Blancpain 50 Fathoms hit 45mm. But in the 1930s, most wristwatches for men had a diameter of around 32 to 33mm, so the Portuguesa, as the style came to be known, must have seemed almost grotesque at the time. The Arabic numerals were a key feature of the Portuguesa, and here they are carried over to the Regulator. This is quite unusual, as most Regulator watches use Roman numerals for the hour register, which appears to be a tradition stemming back to at least the beginning of the 20th century, where Longines produced quite a few Regulators. Today, Glashütte Original does it, Union Glashütte does it, A. Lange & Söhne does it, Chronos Swiss does it, even the uber-utilitarian Sinn does it. But Patek Philippe doesn't, and neither does IWC, as we see here, and that is part of the reason I like this so much. I'm not a fan of using Roman numerals to start with. It's archaic and unnecessarily ornamental, and Arabic numerals are, in my mind, more beautiful than the jagged edges of Roman numerals. It gets even worse when they're mixed. It's a bit like using several typefaces on the dial. The design concept gets watered down, it gets messy. Turning back to the accuracy and the heart that makes this tick, let's turn this watch around. Here, the magic of watchmaking is laid out before us. Before we dig into that though, just a quick 15-second break. Stockpad makes it easy to keep a stock watch list with your own notes and to save articles, all in a user-friendly interface. Stockpad keeps track of changes in price and makes it simple to sort and find your notes. And it's free. Good luck with your investments. First, let me say that winding the watch is a real joy. I normally prefer automatics, so you don't have to think about winding it, and winding my Omega Speedmaster is a bit of a faff. The grip on the crown just isn't that great. But on this IWC, the experience is pleasingly precise and tactile. When we wind the watch, you can see the crown driving the crown wheel, which in turn transfers power to the ratchet wheel on the mainspring barrel that it's connected to. The mainspring inside the barrel, of course, is what stores all that energy we have just supplied. The click, which is this little thing here, prevents the ratchet wheel from rotating clockwise while allowing it to rotate counterclockwise so we can wind the watch. Via the cog wheel, the power is then transferred to the center wheel, which holds the minute hand and rotates once per hour. The so-called third wheel is almost hidden behind the 3/4 nickel silver plate, but this transfers power to the fourth wheel that rotates once per minute and holds the second hand. Here, the powertrain reaches the escape wheel and anchor, which, as you probably know, is what keeps the mainspring from just unwinding in a couple of seconds and the hands of the watch spinning around like mad. The escapement makes the power stored in the mainspring escape at the desired rate, which is, of course, so a full rotation of the center wheel takes exactly 60 minutes. No more, no less. And we can study it all through the transparent caseback on this magnificent IWC. In my review of Omega's Seamaster 300, I'll paste a link in below, I said that I rarely sit and look at the watch's movement. But this is very much an exception. Because it's so exquisite in all its relative simplicity, I've spent quite some time looking at this, including through my watch loop. Watching the rhythmical dance of the hairspring is a real joy. Finally, let's look at the negatives of this IWC, as you can always find some if you imagine the perfect version of the watch you're holding. I have to say though that I'm struggling a bit, and I can only think of one, but in an ideal world, I would have liked this to be a 40mm watch. 43 is just a little big, and because the bezel is so slim, it wears even bigger. The dial is quite in your face. But then again, all that space on the dial is part of what makes it so elegant, and both the history of the Portugieser and the large pocket watch movement inside this regulator justifies the size. It wouldn't be quite the same if it were smaller. But still, had it been a 40mm, I think it would have been more of a daily wearer for me and my 17cm wrist. That's it. The IWC 544-401, also known as the Regulator, was only with us for a couple of years, and I consider myself very privileged to own one. It's a real beauty in the world of watches and a bit of a hidden gem. This watch will arouse a lot more interest than yet another Rolex Explorer or Omega Speedmaster, both from others and yourself, I think. These aren't exactly cheap, but held up against silly Rolex prices and the likes, you are getting a bit of a bargain for something at this level. There are currently 5 specimens of this steel version for sale on Chrono24, and the prices hover around 8 to 8,500 euro. Again, not cheap by any means, but this is truly a special watch, and given their relative rarity, I personally think they will hold their value very well. Let's have a look at the no-nonsense meter. I honestly can't find any nonsense on this watch, so you know what's going to happen. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. It really helps the channel.